Hi, my name's Gabby Romines, and I'm going to be talking about my research about education during the pandemic. My specific segment of research was about teaching during a pandemic, the impact of COVID-19 within higher education. And I was able to do this with the help of Dr. Sarah Murray, Caroline Lancaster, and Patrick Hope. So I want to thank all of them. To start off, I'm just going to go through the APA sections of a paper in this presentation. And so we're going to begin with the introduction. I just thought that I would put the key aspects of our study, pretty much our thesis right here. So COVID-19 significantly altered the roles and responsibilities of college professors. With very short notice, instructors had to entirely rewire their classrooms and develop all new ways of connecting and communicating with students. Despite the countless personal and professional obstacles they faced, college faculty across Kentucky strive to be a source of stability, comfort, and ultimately meet the educational needs of their students. So in general, our presentation, or my project specifically, is about professors and how this pandemic has impacted their jobs and their well-being. So I had a few main goals with my research, and these consist of investigating how professors adapted during COVID-19. This is just on a basic level, what sort of technology they used, maybe what teaching styles, just a straightforward version of what exactly they changed. Secondly, I was hoping to better understand the personal experiences of professors during the pandemic. So this was more from an emotional or a mental health side of things. I was hoping to look at, this was obviously hard on everyone, and if there are any effects specific to college faculty, and just overall get their experience about what this time was like for them. Then third, I was hoping to assess successes and failures in the context of online learning. So just see what things worked and maybe what things didn't work as well. And this could be a helpful reference for the future. And then finally, I was hoping to estimate long-term impacts of the pandemic on higher education. So these are obviously some prestigious goals, and I think I was able to achieve them in some ways, but I definitely would like to further expand upon this to be able to really, really fully answer all these questions. So next I'm going to talk about the methods of my study. I used semi-structured interviews, so they were open-ended and conversational, but they had topics, 5 topics that guided and organized them, and then there were questions underneath the topics, but as an interviewer I could choose to maybe add a few more questions to get at something interesting that interviewees were sharing, or if we had already answered all those questions, then I could maybe cut back a little. So they were just really flexible and helpful, and they're more in depth. So that's kind of why I decided to do semi-structured interviews, to get more detailed information. And this resulted in qualitative data. So we didn't have empirical data that we could run statistical analyses on, but a lot more detailed, specific information is what I gathered from my semi-structured interviews. So this is why I wanted to kind of explain why I chose to get qualitative data instead of having some concrete numerical data. And I'm not gonna, if you want to pause it, you can look at all these things, but I'm just gonna say on a basic level, we wanted more detailed information. And I was hoping to kind of answer more complex problems to understand experiences more. And I didn't feel like I would be able to do that as well with just p-values and that sort of thing. And then also it's cost efficient. And like I said, the interviews are really flexible. And so I just thought for my specific question that it would be more interesting to do longer in-depth interviews and just focus in a broader sense on people's experiences and on what they had to say, as opposed to just trying to answer a really specific and precise question. So I interviewed 6 professors across Kentucky, and we did personal and in-depth and anonymous interviews. They were 65 minutes on average, and I obtained verbal consent before we completed them. Later on, I transcribed the interviews, and then I analyzed any information that I thought was really important and drew out key themes that were reoccurring throughout the different interviews. This is the general structure of my interviews, the key topics that we talked about and what I felt was really important. And so the first one was class content, curriculum, and assessment. This was just about if content was forced to change dramatically, if professors restructured their syllabuses entirely, or if they were able to kind of keep the same content, and then how they assess learning of this content. So this was just the more concrete baseline changes. Next, I had successes and challenges. These were just about what went well, what might have been able to be improved upon, and this is where the majority of the advice for the future could possibly come from. It just gives things that maybe it didn't work, and maybe we don't want to try that one again, but things that collectively professors could shift to because they seem to be really effective in online school. And then next I did topics, thoughts, feelings, and realizations. And this was the more personal or emotional questions, just about what this time was like for them and if their job was similarly fulfilling, and just about faculty's well-being. And then finally, I asked about the future and what my interviewee thought long-term impacts might be, and if they were going to change anything permanently based on what they've learned during the pandemic, that sort of thing. These were just a few examples of some of the questions I asked. I figured it would just be helpful to share a few of the kind of structure of the interview. Did the pandemic cause you to rethink what content you covered or how you evaluate students' learning of it? Will you change either of these in the future according to what you learned during the pandemic? Did your job feel just as meaningful and important as before? Was it similarly fulfilling? Did you feel as if you were still able to connect with students during this time? Were you able to maintain similar relationships with your students? So these were all big questions that I had, things that I was really curious about, and I think I have found the answers to these. So here's my results section. In general, these interviews were really challenging. They were pretty emotional, and in some ways they were overwhelmingly negative. Just a lot of the questions had negative answers, and it was just such a challenging time. So it was hard, but there were also positive things that happened. So to start off, I'm just going to talk about some of the obstacles, things that were disheartening to faculty. And these include lower levels of student engagement and participation. Disparities in performance were exacerbated, meaning if a student might have struggled before transitioning to remote learning, they were probably having a really, really tough time. And then if a student tended to excel before remote learning, they were probably doing wonderfully. And so the gaps just got wider and wider. Next, grading changes and fairness, I heard, was pretty hard, just because all the students had different situations at home, and professors weren't exactly sure what standards to hold them to. And so that was just really confusing and kind of exhausting, is what I heard. And then high levels of time commitment and increased workload. Just transferring a class online in such a short period of time is obviously going to be a huge amount of work. Then on top of that, there's a time commitment of answering emails at many, many hours of the day and having office hours online and that sort of thing. So I think it was just really exhausting, the amount of time people had to put into their jobs, on top of the fact that we were experiencing something that was kind of scary and overwhelming, and you were concerned about family or friends or your own well-being. And so then you were trying to work a full-time job plus extra on, just because with all the things added. So it was just really exhausting, I think. And then finally, a lot of professors had a less meaningful experience in a way. Just they weren't able to get everything that they liked about teaching out of this time. So for example, I talked to a few professors that really valued discussion-based classes, and they were not able to do those obviously in the same way. And so there just wasn't as much student feedback, and they didn't get the same dialogue that they used to. And I think that was just saddening, because that's really, really valued by a lot of faculty. But on a more positive note, a lot of my respondents said that they were still able to build relationships with students and connect with them on some sort of level. And so I thought this was really encouraging. Just despite the fact that things were through a screen, people reported that wasn't as much of a barrier as they were expecting, that they still talked to their students somewhat frequently. And then on top of that, there was a sense of camaraderie. Because this was such a challenging time, professors and students alike were reliant on each other. And so they were going through this experience together, and they had a mutual goal of continuing learning. And so I think that bonded people in some ways. And then finally, a lot of my interviewees felt as if students were still able to learn something in their classes during this time, but it wasn't necessarily what they were supposed to learn. It might have shifted some from what the original class goal was about, but professors still felt that they were able to continue educating in one way or another. So that was really encouraging. So I'm just going to quickly go through basic tools and strategies that a lot of my interviewees used. And some of these are obvious, but I just figured I would compile them anyway. So every one of them used teleconference meetings, lectures, and office hours. And then online discussion forums were helpful. The flipped classroom model, where students learn something and then they come to a synchronous class meeting, or then they watch a professor's videos and they can kind of ask questions and engage with the content in a more in-depth way because they've already learned it on a basic level. Next, a lot of professors use virtual practice questions, simulations, or videos. Many of them switched take tests, original assessments, to take-home tests or papers. And finally, email was really important during this time, because it was just, communication was very, very necessary, and email was a huge help in doing that. Next, I'm just going to talk about something that I learned a lot in my literature review and talking to professors about mental health in academia, because this has been studied and focused on a decent amount with students, and with grad students. It can just be a really high pressure environment with the harsh deadlines and high expectations for products, and it's just a very competitive and success-oriented world. And so oftentimes in academia, there are mental health problems that go overlooked, like just stress and anxiety disorders and depression. Those sort of things they tend to be exacerbated within academia. But that often is not talked about in the context of faculty. It tends to be students more. And there, in fact, is a problem with that in faculty, but it's just not, people aren't as open about it. And this is because of the high expectations and workloads that's put on them, high expectations for publishing research, for making sure that their students achieve specific things and by specific deadlines. There's just a lot that we put onto professors. And on top of that, non-tenure track professors, during this time, there was so much uncertainty about if they could be rehired, and just their job security was really in jeopardy. And so that was a huge stressor. And then during the pandemic specifically, the influence on students and effectiveness as an instructor was shifted. People could do their best to teach as well as they could, but just with the completely new model and everything, I think it was really challenging for a lot of professors to shift so quickly and not cause a change in what they felt they were able to do and how they felt they were able to influence their students. And I think that was really disheartening and made them oftentimes lose sight of what was important about their job, just feel really, really discouraged, I think. And then finally, a lot of professors are expected to be a support system, but they don't necessarily who's supporting them. And so there's very few spaces that professors can talk about the challenges that they're going through. And for example, we have counselors for students, and we really encourage students to go to those, but there isn't always resources like that for professors, and they're in the same sort of competitive, really success-oriented environment. And so oftentimes they need a space to share their experiences as well. Finally, I'm going to talk about circumstantial effects. I think this is clear, but I want to reiterate that obviously people's experiences varied significantly, and they were dependent on different circumstances that they maybe had at home, or dependent on classes that were being taught. So for example, different classes were affected in really different ways. Like a math class wouldn't experience the same sort of changes that a science class with a lab did, because that was easier to transition math online as opposed to a hands-on lab. So anyway, things like that obviously vary a lot. And then also various teaching styles were more or less, I don't know if effective is exactly the right word, just easier to move to remote. So teacher-centered educational philosophies, where it was more lecture-based and a teacher giving information to their students, that was a lot easier to move online, because you could just record yourself doing that, and then the students could just consume that media, watch a video, that sort of thing. But if you had a student-centered educational philosophy, this time could be a lot harder, because you didn't have half as much of the student feedback, you didn't have this back and forth dialogue in class, or you couldn't have discussions in the same way. And so all that was much, much more challenging to figure out how to transition that online. And then next, students had differing situations at home, so that made it hard for professors to have some sort of standardization in school in the way that they were assessed, or even just in assignments. Some students might have been watching 3 younger siblings, and so it was way more challenging for them to complete even a short assignment than it would be for another person who could focus entirely on school. And so that weighed on professors a lot, I think, trying to make the decision about what was fair. And then on top of that, professors had differing situations at home. Some might have had children to watch, and things like that change what this experience was like significantly. But finally, I just want to say that in general, problems, like pre-existing problems, often just became exacerbated even more. So for example, if a student was struggling before, they probably struggled even more. And if you originally had a young child and had to find childcare and stuff, that can be challenging sometimes. But now there is no childcare available. Just things that might present a challenge before probably presented an even larger challenge during this time. So I would like to expand upon the long-term effects that I found. I think that I could probably pull more out, but these were the ones that stuck out to me initially. So a few of my professors think that this is going to head in the direction of more online school, just because it's cheaper. You can have one person teaching a large class if it's just through videos and that sort of thing. And it can also be monetized through different programs and selling videos and different, I read a lot of articles about how this might be the future of schooling, just in that there's profit in this area. And so for that reason, some people might turn to it. But this would lead to fewer teachers needing to be hired. And as an education minor, I obviously think that there's so many benefits of in-classroom teaching and so many amazing things that teachers are able to do. And I think that you definitely lose some value if school is completely online. But some people think that that's the direction that we're heading in. So that's really interesting. And then a final long-term effect is just that pre-existing gaps are amplified. So performance gaps, I've already touched on this a little bit, but students that might have needed a little more guidance and a little more help weren't able to get that during this time. And so it just further expanded the extremes of students. And so that's kind of frustrating and disheartening. So finally, I'm just going to talk about what my results mean and why I think they're important. In general, they just summarize teachers' experiences, and I wanted to give teachers an outlet and a voice to talk about what all happened. And so I think that my results are able to do that. And then next, they provide clarity and advice. They just kind of encapsulate this really hectic time. And I think that is important to just reflect back on everything that happened and how we all responded to it and how faculty responded to it, that sort of thing. And advice just in the context of you can look at these results to figure out what worked for some people and maybe what other professors can do. But I would like to kind of expand upon that section a little more as well. And then finally, I learned a lot about the culture within academia, and I think this is really important and needs to be talked about more. And so I hope that my results can draw attention to that and that research in that area will be furthered because it is a big problem. All right, finally, I'm just going to talk about some of the limitations of my study. I had a small sample size, and that was, by the nature of my study, that was bound to happen, but I think that it definitely could have been expanded a little bit. And then next, I could have conducted further analyses. So just the time constraints, I would like to look at the data that I have collected even more in depth than I did. I didn't collect concrete or numerical data, and this isn't inherently bad. It just means that the results aren't as generalizable and they're not quite as clear or concise. There's a lot of variance within them. And then that's related to, this was just a really broad topic. And so I think that I could have looked at some more specific research questions and had it be a little more straightforward and clear. So finally, these are just a few ideas for future research. I still think that the project that I am working on, this could be expanded. It is a work in progress, but there's also other questions that I've developed in doing this research. One of these is just, I was originally hoping to do a comparative analysis of varying educational levels. I was looking at higher education, and I had partners that were looking at other levels of education, high school, early education, and we were hoping to compare these. But just with the time frame, we weren't able to do this. And I think that that could be really, really interesting and important. And then next, I would be curious to look more at mental health within academia, and especially during COVID-19. I was able to find some academic research about this in some articles, but it's still really limited. And I'm curious, it appears to be an important topic. And then finally, I'd like to just look at, on a more specific level, traditions that were forced to change. So standardized tests, that's a long-standing tradition that schools have always relied on, and all of a sudden you weren't able to implement it in the same way. And just so I'm curious about the implications of that. So anyway, there's a lot of further questions that could be explored in this, but I hope that I was able to communicate something important. Here's a few of my references, and there's a few more. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you find this topic as interesting as I do.